Brute on bike punches 60-year-old woman. Unaware J.D. Vance was watching. It was a crisp autumn morning in the heart of the city, where the hustle and bustle of daily life painted a picture of normalcy. People rushed through crosswalks, the chatter of vendors filled the air, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee swirled through the streets. Among the throngs of commuters, one person stood out, a 60-year-old woman named Clara Jenkins. Clara wasn't anyone famous, nor did she have a reputation beyond her small but well-loved bakery that stood at the corner of Ashford and First. But to the people who knew her, Clara was a pillar of kindness. Her silver hair gleamed in the sunlight as she made her way through the streets, carrying a basket of freshly baked bread. She smiled at everyone she passed, a routine that had come to define her. However, on this particular morning, her peaceful routine would be shattered. As Clara reached the busy intersection, she noticed a young man riding a bike far too fast for the crowded city street. He had a rough look about him, tattoos on his arms, a scowl on his face, and a general aura of aggression. His eyes were locked forward, not bothering to avoid the pedestrians, and his bike weaved dangerously between people. Clara didn't think much of him at first. It was just another person in a hurry. But as he sped past her, something shifted. Without warning, he swerved and delivered a sharp blow to her chest with his elbow. The force was enough to knock Clara off her feet, sending her crashing onto the cold concrete. A gasp of disbelief escaped her lips as she landed on the ground, her bread basket flying from her hands and scattering the fresh loaves. The brute on the bike didn't even pause. Without a second glance, he sped away, his bike tires screeching against the pavement as he disappeared into the distance. The crowd, momentarily frozen in shock, slowly began to react. Some rushed to Clara's aid, others whispered in disbelief. But the pain Clara felt was not just physical. She had been attacked by someone for no reason, and that wound cut deeper than any bruise. But in the background, a very different reaction was unfolding. Across the street, standing at the edge of the park, was none other than the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance. He had just finished a brief meeting with local officials and was taking a rare moment to walk through the city. It was part of his new initiative to connect with everyday people, and today he had decided to enjoy a quiet walk rather than attend a crowded event. His presence in the city had been kept quiet, a simple walk through the streets incognito to learn more about the issues that plagued everyday Americans. He hadn't expected to witness anything like this. JD's eyes had caught the moment. Clara was shoved, the brute's violence unmistakable. His pulse quickened and his instincts kicked in. For a brief moment he debated whether to intervene. The brute had already ridden away and a few bystanders were attending to Clara. But J.D. Vance was a man who had spent years advocating for the underdog. He knew the feeling of being overlooked, of being left behind, and something about Clara's vulnerability stirred a deep sense of justice within him. Without thinking further, J.D. walked briskly toward the scene, his shoes tapping sharply against the sidewalk as he approached Clara, who was now sitting on the pavement dazed. "Ma'am, are you okay?" J.D.'s voice was calm but filled with concern. Clara looked up, her eyes bleary from the impact, and then froze when she saw who was speaking to her. She had recognized the man immediately. J.D. Vance, the vice president. "Oh, my... I didn't expect," Clara stammered, still in shock. "Don't worry," J.D. said, bending down to offer her a hand. "Let's get you up, all right?" With some assistance, Clara stood shakily, her knees trembling. One of the onlookers offered her a bottle of water, and she gratefully accepted, trying to regain her composure. As she did, she scanned the street for any sign of the man who had hit her, but he was long gone. "Do you need medical attention?" J.D. asked, his voice gentle yet authoritative. Clara shook her head, brushing a few strands of hair out of her face. "No, I'm all right. Just a little shaken." J.D. nodded, his mind racing. The situation had been so quick and yet so devastating. He had seen violence before, but to witness it so casually in the middle of the street struck him deeply. His mind raced with possibilities. Could this be a reflection of something larger, something he could address? Or was it just the random act of an angry individual? "What's your name?" JD asked, trying to shift the focus to something more comforting. "Clara," she replied softly, still recovering from the shock. "Clara Jenkins." "Clara, I'm so sorry this happened to you," JD said, his expression solemn. "Is there anyone we can contact for you? Family? Friends?" Clara thought for a moment before nodding. "I have a daughter, but she lives a little far. I'll be fine, really. It's just the way things are sometimes, I suppose." JD hesitated. Something didn't sit right with him. The brute had taken no time to even look back. He had just punched her and kept going. JD knew that kind of behavior was symptomatic of something deeper, something that couldn't be ignored. As Clara began to walk off, aided by a few concerned citizens, JD made a quick decision. He wasn't just going to let this slide. He would find that man. JD Vance stood in the middle of the street, watching Clara as she slowly walked away, her back hunched slightly from the shock of what had just happened. He could still feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins. This wasn't just a random act of aggression. It felt more personal, more rooted in something bigger. As Clara disappeared into the crowd, JD turned and scanned the area, looking for any sign of the brute. His heart pounded in his chest, not just from the confrontation he had witnessed, but from the urgency he felt in addressing the deeper issue that had brought this all about. He pulled out his phone and called his security team. "I need you to track a bike rider," he said. "A young man, aggressive. He punched an elderly woman. I need to know where he went." The call was short, but the response was quick. Within minutes, JD was walking to the corner of the street where a surveillance camera had caught the cyclist's path. The footage showed him weaving through traffic with reckless abandon before turning into an alleyway. "Got it," JD muttered to himself, adjusting his coat. The cold air bit at his face, but the chill did nothing to cool the fire inside him. He wasn't sure why this situation had grabbed him so strongly, but he knew he couldn't just let it go. He followed the path down the alley, his mind racing. The brute had disappeared into the shadows of the city, but JD wasn't about to give up. He wasn't one to back down, especially when he saw the potential for a deeper issue. Anger, violence. It had been an undercurrent of society for years, and JD had always been one to speak up about it. He had spent years in politics advocating for working-class Americans, but he knew that real change didn't come from the top. You're down. It came from the grassroots. It came from understanding people's struggles, their pain, their need for guidance. As he turned the corner, JD spotted a man loitering near a bike rack. His posture was stiff, his arms crossed, and his eyes darted nervously. JD's gut told him that this was the man. He didn't hesitate. Stepping forward, he called out, "Hey, you there! I need to talk to you." The man's eyes widened, and he quickly tried to walk away. But JD was faster. He blocked the exit to the alley, his presence imposing yet calm. "I'm not going to hurt you, but I want to talk," JD said, keeping his voice firm yet inviting. The man froze, his hands clenching into fists. "What do you want, man? You're not supposed to be here," he spat, a mixture of defiance and fear in his voice. "I saw what you did," JD said, his voice steady. "To the woman. You punched her. What was that about?" The man tensed, then sneered. "What's it to you, huh? You gonna lecture me? I don't need anyone's help." JD shook his head, taking a step forward, but maintaining a non-threatening posture. "It's not about lecturing, I just want to understand. People don't act like that unless something's going on. What happened to you? Why did you feel like you had to hit her?" The man stared at JD for a long moment, his eyes shifting between suspicion and confusion. He was trying to figure out why someone like JD, someone so high up, someone so powerful, was talking to him. A stranger, a man who had just committed an act of violence. "I don't know you, man," the man muttered. "And you don't know me?" "You're right," JD said, "but I want to. That's the difference." There was silence for a moment, and JD could see the man's walls starting to crack. He was struggling with something deep inside, and JD could feel it. It wasn't just rage, it was desperation, loneliness, the kind of pain that festered and grew, turning into anger and violence until it was all that was left. "You're right," the man finally said, his voice quieter now. "I don't know what I'm doing, I don't know what else to do. I've been angry for so long, I don't even know why anymore." JD's expression softened. He wasn't here to judge. He had heard stories like this before. People who had been caught in cycles of pain, anger, and disillusionment. People who needed someone to help them break out of it. "You don't have to keep living like this," JD said, his voice calm but filled with conviction. "You don't have to carry that anger around anymore." The man looked down, his eyes filled with conflict. "I don't know how," he admitted, his voice almost breaking. "It's all I know, it's all I've got." JD took a deep breath. This wasn't going to be easy, and he wasn't naive enough to think that one conversation would change everything. But he had to try. "There's help out there," JD said, his voice steady. "There are programs, people, who can show you how to cope, how to deal with anger in a way that doesn't hurt anyone. It's not weak to ask for help, it's not weak to want to change." The man's face tightened. "What if I can't change? What if I'm too far gone?" "Then you fight," JD said, locking eyes with him. "You fight, and you keep fighting. You don't give up." There was a long pause, and for the first time the man didn't look away. His shoulders slumped, the anger that had once been so overpowering now replaced with something else, something softer, more vulnerable. I don't know if I can trust that," he muttered. JD took another step forward, lowering his voice. "I understand. But trust me when I say that it's worth trying. You're not alone in this. I'm here to help. We all are." The man swallowed, hard, his eyes searching JD's face. For a moment it seemed like he might turn away, but then he nodded, just slightly. "Okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll think about it." JD gave him a small, reassuring smile. "That's all I ask." With that, JD watched as the man, now visibly conflicted but slightly more at peace, turned and slowly walked away, his bike forgotten for the moment. JD stood there for a moment longer, watching him disappear down the street. He didn't know if this was the beginning of something meaningful for the man, but he knew one thing for sure. It was a start. JD's thoughts turned back to Clara. He had helped the man, but he couldn't forget the woman who had been victimized. He had to make sure that she was okay, that she had the support she needed. Turning, JD walked back to the intersection where he spotted Clara sitting on a bench with a kind stranger by her side. Her hands were wrapped around a cup of tea, and, though her face still carried the marks of the attack, there was a sense of peace about her now. He approached her with a smile. "Clara, I just wanted to check in. How are you feeling?" She looked up at him, surprised but grateful. "I'm okay, Mr. Vice President. I'm fine, really. Just a little shaken, you know." JD sat beside her, nodding. "I understand, but if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. We'll make sure something like this doesn't happen again." Clara smiled softly, the warmth returning to her eyes. "Thank you, JD. That means more than you know." As JD sat there with Clara, watching the world go by, he felt a sense of purpose settle in his chest. Today had been more than just a political gesture. It had been a moment of connection, of understanding, of real change. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was always a chance for light. The chill of the morning had subsided as the sun climbed higher in the sky, and with it, the bustling streets began to regain their usual rhythm. But for JD Vance, the events of the day had carved a deep impression on him. He sat on the bench next to Clara, watching as life unfolded around them. Cars honked in the distance, the hum of conversation rose from the surrounding cafes, and the occasional cyclist zipped by, but there was a weight to it all now. It wasn't just background noise. It felt like the pulse of a world that needed more than just political speeches or policy changes. It needed something more personal, more human. Clara, though still shaken, had begun to settle into a quieter composure. She sipped her tea, her hands slightly trembling, but gradually finding steadiness. JD could tell that the kind words, the attention, and the support from the bystanders had begun to heal some of the invisible wounds. But he also saw something deeper. Clara wasn't just physically affected, she was emotionally scarred by what had happened. The suddenness of the assault, the feeling of powerlessness, it had shaken her trust in the world. JD knew that healing would take time. "Clara, I know this isn't easy," he said after a moment, breaking the silence. "I want to make sure you're getting the help you need. If you'd like, we can set up a meeting with local resources that offer support for victims of violence. It might help you process what happened and find some peace." Clara hesitated, the offer clearly weighing on her. "I don't know. I don't want to be a burden, especially not to you, Mr. Vice President." "Clara," JD replied, his voice warm but firm, "you're not a burden. Everyone deserves to feel safe, to feel heard. What happened to you was wrong, and no one should go through something like this alone." She looked at him for a long moment, and JD could see the conflict in her eyes. Finally, she nodded, albeit slowly. I think I could use some help," she said softly. "Thank you." JD gave her a reassuring smile. "Good. We'll get you the support you need." They sat together in a comfortable silence for a few minutes longer, and JD felt a sense of responsibility settle over him. The situation with the brute on the bike was far from resolved. He had seen a crack in the man's armor, had heard the vulnerability in his voice. It was the kind of thing JD couldn't ignore. As Clara stood up, brushing herself off, she gave him one last thankful look before slowly walking away, a group of supportive strangers walking beside her. JD watched her go, his mind now entirely focused on the next step, the man who had attacked her. He needed to find him. Later that afternoon, JD sat in his office staring at a map of the city spread out before him. The footage from the alley was clear, but the man had been swift, disappearing into the shadows so quickly that there was no way to trace him through traditional means. The only lead was his bike, a low-cost street racer model that JD had no doubt was used for more than just recreation. His security team had done their best to track down every possible lead, but there was something off about this whole situation. The brute hadn't acted out of self-defense or malice toward Clara specifically. No, it was the casualness of the violence that troubled JD. The man had attacked without a second thought, then simply disappeared as though it were an everyday occurrence. This wasn't just random violence, it was a symptom of something bigger, something JD had seen in his time working in politics. He picked up his phone and dialed the number of a local activist and community leader, Maria Harris. She was known for her work with at-risk youth, particularly young men who found themselves on the wrong side of the law. Maria's background was rooted in both compassion and tough love. She had a gift for reaching people who were in desperate need of help. "Maria," JD greeted her when she answered, his voice firm but kind. "It's JD Vance. Listen, I need your help with something." Maria's voice immediately took on a serious tone. "What's going on?" "I saw something today, a violent act, and I need to understand why. There was a young man, around 20, maybe 25. He punched a 60-year-old woman on the street for no reason, and then he just rode off. I talked to him, and he admitted he didn't know why he did it. Just anger, just frustration. But he's not the first person to act like this, and I'm worried there's more going on. I need to know if there's any program or initiative that could help someone like him." Maria was quiet for a moment, then spoke. "You're right to be worried. It's not just about anger. That kind of violence doesn't come from nowhere. A lot of these young men are acting out because they don't know how to cope with what's happening in their lives, poverty, trauma, and a lack of direction. There's a deep-rooted frustration, but no one's giving them the tools to handle it." JD nodded as he listened, absorbing her words. "I need to find him, Maria. Not to punish him, but to help him. I want to see if there's a chance for him to turn things around." Maria sighed. "I can get you the names of a few programs. But JD, it's going to be tough. People like him, they don't want help at first, and sometimes they don't know how to accept it." "I know," JD replied, "but I think he's willing to listen. He might not trust me, but I've seen enough to know that if he's given a chance, there's hope. We can't give up on people like him." Maria paused, then said, "All right, I'll send you some names, but you got to act fast. If he's left to his own devices, things can spiral quickly." "Thank you, Maria. I appreciate it." After hanging up, JD took a deep breath. There was still much to be done. He couldn't help but think of Clara, her words, her vulnerability, and how her experience had become a catalyst for something much bigger than just a random act of violence. JD had seen the ripple effect of change before, how one person's story could touch the lives of many, and he was beginning to realize that this young man on the bike was no exception. The days following the incident passed in a blur for JD. He spent hours reviewing footage from surveillance cameras, speaking with local activists, and meeting with law enforcement to gather every scrap of information on the man who had attacked Clara. There was something about the case that gnawed at him, something that felt like unfinished business. He couldn't just let it go, not when he felt the weight of Clara's trust in him and the deep sense of obligation to those who felt forgotten by society. His team had made a breakthrough. They identified the man as Leo Sanchez, a 24-year-old, who had grown up in a rough neighborhood just outside the city. His criminal record was minimal, mostly small offenses, but nothing that could explain the violent outburst he had directed at Clara. The more JD looked into Leo's past, the more he realized that this wasn't an isolated incident of anger. It was part of a much bigger picture, an individual trapped in a cycle of poverty, anger, and abandonment. It wasn't just about stopping a criminal, it was about understanding the root of the issue and finding a way to help people like Leo. Before they lashed out, JD was sitting in his office late one evening when he received a message from Maria. She had managed to arrange a meeting for him with Leo, though it was far from a guarantee that the young man would show up. JD had his doubts, but there was a flicker of hope inside him. Perhaps this would be the moment when everything changed. The meeting was set for the following day at a community center on the outskirts of town, a place that had been instrumental in helping troubled youth get back on their feet. JD didn't expect miracles, but he hoped that by showing Leo he cared, he could reach him. He didn't know if it would work, but he had to try. The next morning, JD arrived at the community center with his security team in tow. The building was modest but vibrant, with murals on the walls and the sound of laughter coming from the interior. Inside, a group of teenagers was gathered in a circle, laughing and sharing stories. They looked up as JD entered, and some of them stared in awe. After all, it wasn't every day that the Vice President of the United States walked through their doors. Maria greeted him with a smile, though it was clear she was just as uncertain as JD about how things would go. "He's here," she said, nodding toward the back of the room. Leo was sitting on a bench, his posture tense, arms crossed. He looked out of place in the colorful, community-centered environment. His eyes were dark, and there was a hardness to his gaze that spoke of years of built-up anger. JD approached him slowly, allowing the young man to take in his presence. He wasn't here to make Leo feel small or to preach. He was here to make a connection, Leo, JD said, keeping his voice calm and neutral. I'm glad you agreed to meet with me. Leo didn't respond immediately, but after a long pause he muttered, I didn't agree to anything. Maria told me I should meet you. I don't need your help. JD smiled softly, not letting Leo's hostility throw him off balance. I understand. You don't need my help, not yet anyway, but maybe you'll listen. Maybe we can just talk. Leo glanced up at him, eyes narrowing. Talk? About what? About why you punched that woman, JD said gently, but with a firm edge. Why you let your anger take over without even thinking about it. Leo shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. You don't know anything about me, he said, almost defensively. You don't know what I've been through. You're right, JD admitted, sitting down across from him. I don't, but I want to understand, because what happened that day, it wasn't just about you and Clara, it's about something bigger. About everything you've been dealing with, everything that made you feel like you had no choice but to lash out. Leo looked away, the silence between them thick and uncomfortable. JD knew this wasn't going to be easy. He had seen men like Leo before, men who had been hardened by life's disappointments. But JD also knew that if Leo was ever going to change, he needed to feel seen, heard, and understood. Leo, I know things aren't easy, JD continued. I know you've been dealt a tough hand, but that anger, that frustration, it doesn't have to define you. It doesn't have to control what happens next. Leo's expression softened ever so, slightly, but there was still a guardedness to him. It's not that simple. You think just because you tell me to be better, I can suddenly change. You don't know the things I've had to do to survive. JD nodded, acknowledging the pain in Leo's words. No, I don't. But I do know that you don't have to keep living like this, that there's a better way forward. And if you want, I can help you find it. We can help you find it. The room was silent again, and for the first time, JD saw a crack in Leo's tough exterior. He looked up, his eyes searching JD's face, as if trying to gauge the sincerity behind the words. Why do you care? Leo asked, his voice quieter now. Because I believe in people, JD said, his tone unshakable. I believe that no one is beyond redemption, Leo, and I believe that you deserve better than this. You don't have to keep running on anger. You can find peace. Leo looked at him for a long time, his face a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. Finally he spoke again, though his voice was quieter this time. I don't know if I can do that, he admitted. JD leaned in slightly, his voice earnest. You don't have to know right now. Just take it one step at a time. You don't have to have all the answers, but you can choose a different path, a better path. There was a long pause, but then Leo nodded, just slightly, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't a grand declaration of change, but it was enough to give JD hope. The days that followed were not easy. JD knew that. Leo wasn't going to magically transform overnight, but JD stayed in contact, offering resources, giving Leo the space he needed to process the conversation. He connected him with Maria's programs, which focused on helping young men cope with their emotions and break cycles of violence. It wasn't a smooth journey. There were setbacks. Leo struggled with trusting the process, with trusting that there was something better for him. But there were also small victories, moments where Leo would show up at the community center, where he would participate in group activities, where he would speak about his struggles without lashing out. And Clara was healing too. She had agreed to take part in a support group for victims of violence, something that gave her a sense of agency over what had happened to her. She too was on a journey, one that would take time, but one that was leading her towards strength and resilience. In the end, JD knew that the journey for both Clara and Leo had just begun. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be worth it. Because sometimes the smallest acts of kindness, the willingness to listen, to understand, could be the catalysts for real change. And that, JD realized, as he watched Leo and Clara both take their tentative steps toward healing, was the true meaning of leadership.